The world was one vote away from becoming ash, and nobody on the American side knew that the fate of 300 million lives was in the hands of a sweating Soviet officer trapped at the bottom of the Caribbean Sea, convinced the war had already started, and holding a nuclear torpedo aimed at the United States Navy. October 27, 1962. Somewhere beneath the dark waters of the Sargasso Sea, a Soviet submarine called B-59 has been running silent for 3 days. The air inside is toxic. The temperature has climbed above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Men are passing out on the floor. The batteries are nearly dead. And the captain, a man named Valentin Savitsky, has just given an order that should not exist outside of a nightmare. Load the nuclear torpedo. 2 of the 3 officers required to authorize the launch have already said yes. The political officer said yes. The captain is saying yes. There is one man left. One man in a steel tube at the bottom of the ocean, surrounded by unconscious sailors and the sound of depth charges exploding against the hull like a god hammering from the outside. One man who has to decide, right now, whether to end the world. His name was Vasili Arkhipov. He was 34 years old, and what he said in the next few minutes would determine whether you and I are alive today. This is the story of the most dangerous moment of the entire Cold War. Not the moment most people think of, not Kennedy at his desk, not Khrushchev at the Kremlin, not the famous 13 days of diplomacy and brinksmanship that history books have covered 1,000 times. This is the moment that happened underneath all of that, in a place no one was watching, where the real decision was made by men whose names the world would not learn for 40 years. It is also a story about American power, about what the United States Navy built in secret, what it was capable of doing, and how it performed with absolute precision during the most dangerous 2 weeks in the history of the Republic. The men on those destroyers above the B-59 were professionals executing their mission flawlessly. They had no idea that 200 feet below them, their flawless execution had pushed a Soviet captain to the edge of a decision that would have killed them all. America was so good at what it did that it almost destroyed itself. And no one knew. We are going to spend the next 50 minutes inside that story, inside the submarine, inside the destroyer groups above it, inside the White House, and the Kremlin, and the specific technology that made all of it possible. By the end, you will understand why Robert McNamara, the man who was Secretary of Defense during those 13 days, said 40 years later that they had come closer to nuclear war than anyone knew at the time. And you will understand why one man's refusal to say a single word saved the world more completely than any diplomat, any general, or any president ever did. To understand what happened on October 27, 1962, you need to understand what the United States Navy had quietly built in the years before that day. Because the story of B-59 is, at its core, a story about American technological supremacy so complete, so invisible, and so overwhelming that the Soviets never had a chance, and never knew it. In the early 1950s, the United States Navy faced a problem that kept admirals awake at night. The Soviet Union had the largest submarine fleet in the world, hundreds of diesel-electric boats, many of them based on the best German designs captured at the end of World War II. An ocean is a very large place to hide a submarine. The Navy needed a way to see underwater across thousands of miles, and it needed to do it before those submarines could threaten American ships, American coastlines, or American lives. What they built was one of the greatest feats of engineering in American history, and one of the most successfully kept secrets of the Cold War. They called it SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System. And the way it worked was almost elegant in its simplicity. even as its scale was staggering. Scientists had discovered, years earlier, that the ocean has a natural sound channel deep beneath the surface, a layer where temperature and pressure create conditions that allow low-frequency sound to travel extraordinary distances without dissipating. A sound made in that channel off the coast of Norway could be detected, with the right equipment, off the coast of Bermuda. The Navy realized that if they could place listening devices, hydrophones, in that channel, connected by cables to shore stations, they could hear Soviet submarines anywhere in the Atlantic Ocean. So, they did exactly that. Starting in the early 1950s, working under deep classification, American engineers placed arrays of hydrophones on the ocean floor in a chain stretching from Nova Scotia all the way to Barbados, a vast acoustic curtain drawn across the Atlantic. The shore stations received the signals and analyzed them, looking for the specific sound signatures of Soviet submarine engines and propellers. Each submarine had a unique acoustic fingerprint. Once you knew what a submarine sounded like, you could identify it by name from hundreds of miles away. By July of 1962, 3 months before the Cuban Missile Crisis, the system had achieved its first confirmed detection of a Soviet nuclear submarine transiting the Atlantic. The Soviets had no idea the system existed. They thought they were moving through an empty ocean. They were moving through a room full of American ears. When Khrushchev ordered 4 diesel submarines to slip quietly from their base on the Kola Peninsula and make the crossing to Cuba in early October of 1962, he believed they were invisible. The Navy knew they were coming almost from the moment they left port. 4 submarines, each carrying 1 nuclear torpedo with roughly the explosive power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, moving across the Atlantic toward Cuba, and the United States Navy was waiting. Kennedy had given the order, "Find them." And so the Navy mobilized something the world had never seen before. More than 200 combat surface ships, nearly 200 shore-based aircraft, 4 aircraft carrier search and attack groups, with 50 to 60 planes on each. 85% of American anti-submarine forces in the entire Atlantic pointed at 4 submarines. The USS Randolph, an Essex-class carrier that had fought in the Pacific in World War II and now led the most advanced anti-submarine warfare group in the world, moved into the Sargasso Sea. Her destroyers spread out across miles of ocean. Her aircraft began their patterns. The hunt was on. The Soviet submarines never had a chance. They were too noisy. They had been ordered to travel at maximum speed to reach Cuba quickly, and the rush had stressed their machinery and worsened their acoustic signatures. Their radio communications had been careless, and beneath them, on the ocean floor, the ears of SOSUS were listening to every vibration of every shaft and every turn of every propeller. One by one, the American forces found them. B-130 was forced to surface after all 3 of its diesel engines broke down. B-4, B-36, and B-59 were located and pinned by destroyer groups using multi-frequency sonar, towed sono-locators, radio hydroacoustic buoys, and what the after-action reports described simply as all means available. The Soviets had brought what they believed were the best submarines in the world. They had sailed them 7,000 miles across the Atlantic in secret, and within days of entering the Caribbean, every one of them was being tracked by American forces with a precision that the Soviet Navy would not have believed possible. Vasili Arkhipov was born on January 30, 1926, in a small village outside Moscow. He grew up in a country that had lost 27 million people in 4 years of war against the Germans, a country where the memory of catastrophic surprise attack was woven into the national psychology at a cellular level. He joined the Soviet Navy and proved good at his work, methodical, calm, the kind of officer who thinks before he acts, which is rarer than it sounds in any military. By 1961, he had risen to the position of deputy commander of a submarine called K-19. The K-19 was one of the Soviet Navy's first nuclear-powered submarines, and in July of 1961, while on exercise in the North Atlantic, its reactor coolant system developed a catastrophic leak. Without coolant, the reactor would overheat and melt down, almost certainly triggering a nuclear explosion. The crew had no proper radiation suits. They had no backup system. They had, in the end, only the willingness of 8 men to enter the reactor compartment in improvised lead shielding and manually repair the leak with their hands. All 8 of those men died within a month from acute radiation syndrome. Others from the crew died in the months and years that followed. Arkhipov survived, but he had been exposed to significant radiation. He had stood close enough to the edge of a nuclear catastrophe to understand, in a way that most human beings never have to, exactly what it means. He had seen what radiation does to a human body. He had watched men die from it. A year later, in October of 1962, Arkhipov was assigned to the Cuba mission not as the captain of B-59, but as the flotilla chief of staff, the commanding officer of the entire 4-submarine group. He was aboard B-59 because it was the flagship. He was not supposed to be in the chain of command for a nuclear launch. He was there for administrative reasons. And because he was there, because his rank required that a 3rd signature be added to the authorization process that on every other submarine required only 2, the world did not end. The captain of B-59 was Valentin Savitsky. He was a capable officer, experienced, competent under normal conditions. But the conditions inside B-59 by the morning of October 27th were not normal by any definition the word has ever had. His crew had been at sea for weeks. They had crossed the Atlantic at high speed. They had been running from American forces for 3 days, diving deep, conserving power, trying to hide in an ocean that the Americans had somehow made transparent. The air conditioning had failed completely. The temperature inside the pressure hull had climbed to levels that made sustained rational thought physiologically difficult. Men were lying on the floor because they did not have the strength to stand. The drinking water ration was 1 cup per man per day. The batteries were nearly exhausted, and there had been no communication from Moscow for several days. No orders, no context, no information about whether the crisis above the surface had escalated or resolved. Savitsky did not know if the war had started. He could not know. And the depth charges, the American signaling charges designed to communicate surface, not to destroy, were indistinguishable from inside a steel hull at the bottom of the sea, from a real attack. The chase on October 27th had begun in the darkness before dawn. One of the Randolph's tracker aircraft had laid sonobuoys despite violent weather and found B-59's acoustic signature just after midnight. The destroyer USS Coney picked up solid sonar contact first, and then the USS Beale joined the pursuit. The USS Murray maintained constant pinging for 4 straight hours. The destroyers circled B-59 like wolves that had run a deer to exhaustion, closing in, holding contact, waiting. Inside B-59, the sounds of that pursuit were something no training had prepared the crew to endure. The pings of American sonar against the hull, the distant explosions of signaling charges, each one reverberating through the steel like a physical blow. The officers knew that American sonar operators could hear them breathing. They knew that the Americans knew exactly where they were. And they had heard nothing from Moscow in days. No instructions, no reassurance. no context for what was happening above them. The air inside was running out. Not metaphorically. The carbon dioxide content had risen to levels that produced confusion, panic, and eventually loss of consciousness. The oxygen content was dropping. Men who had been awake for days in heat that would have closed most workplaces were now breathing air that was actively poisoning them. The desalination equipment had broken down. There was almost no clean water. The batteries, which powered everything, including the ability to move, were so depleted that the submarine could neither run nor hide. One member of the crew, a naval intelligence officer named Vadim Orlov, described the experience of those depth charges later in a memoir. He said it felt like sitting in a metal barrel while someone outside hammered it continuously with a sledgehammer. That was the experience of men who knew they were signaling charges, designed not to kill, but to communicate. Imagine what it felt like to men who had lost contact with Moscow, who did not know if the war had started, who were running on no sleep and no water and no oxygen, who felt each explosion as a physical impact against the hull that surrounded them. Savitsky broke, not completely, not the way a man breaks in a movie, with screaming and irrational behavior. He broke the way a rational man breaks when the information available to him is incomplete and the physical conditions he is operating under make clear thinking nearly impossible. He looked at what he knew, surrounded, out of power, out of air, out of water, no contact with Moscow, explosions against the hull, and he reached a conclusion that, given his information and his condition, was not unreasonable. The war had started. The Americans were attacking. He was going to die here, in this tube at the bottom of the Caribbean, and he was not going to die doing nothing. He ordered the nuclear torpedo loaded and armed. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, agreed. 2 of the 3 required authorizations were in place. The torpedo was a T-5. Its warhead carried roughly the explosive power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It was pointed from its position in the deep water beneath the Sargasso Sea directly at the surface ships overhead. American destroyers, an American carrier, American sailors doing their jobs with professionalism and precision, none of whom knew what was below them. Arkhipov said no. We do not have a transcript of what was said in that compartment. The Soviet Navy suppressed the story for 40 years, and the men who were there gave fragmentary accounts over the decades that followed. What we know is that there was an argument, a real argument with raised voices and genuine disagreement in a steel tube at the bottom of the sea, where men were collapsing from heat and oxygen deprivation. Savitsky wanted to fire. He had said, "We will die, but we will sink them all." He meant it. He was a naval officer who had spent his career preparing for exactly this scenario: enemy forces attacking a Soviet vessel, and the scenario had arrived. The protocols existed. The authorization existed. The torpedo existed. 2 of 3 votes were already yes. Arkhipov said no. And then he did something harder than saying no. He explained why. What he said, in substance, was this: "We do not know that the war has started. We have heard explosions, but we have no confirmation from Moscow that we are at war. If we fire this torpedo without confirmation, we may be the ones who start the war, not the Americans. If we surface, and it turns out the war has not started, we can be recalled. If we fire and the war has not started, there is no taking it back. The Hiroshima bomb killed 70,000 people in the first seconds. This torpedo is aimed at American sailors, who may be doing exactly what their orders tell them to do. We do not kill men for following orders before we know we are at war. He had said variations of this argument for what the accounts suggest was somewhere between 20 minutes and an hour. In conditions of heat and oxygen, deprivation and exhaustion that made thinking difficult for everyone in the compartment. With the knowledge that every minute they spent arguing was a minute the batteries were dying and the options were narrowing. He had one advantage that neither Savitsky nor Maslenikov had. He had been on K-19. He had seen the reactor compartment. He had watched 8 men die in the weeks after they went in with their improvised shielding and their bare hands and saved the ship. He knew what a nuclear weapon does, not as a military abstraction, not as a warhead in a tube, but as a physical reality applied to human tissue. And he knew, with a certainty that comes only from having been that close to it, that firing this torpedo was a decision that could not be undone. Savitsky eventually agreed to surface. We do not know precisely what changed his mind. The accounts suggest that Arkhipav's argument was persuasive, that his reputation from K-19 gave his words weight that they might not have had from another officer, and that the practical reality of the submarine's condition, nearly dead batteries, nearly no air, made surfacing not just the wise choice, but eventually the only choice. They were going to surface whether they fired or not. The only question was whether they surfaced as men who had just started a nuclear war or as men who had survived a very bad few days. At 8:53 in the evening on October 27, 1962, Soviet submarine B-59 surfaced in the middle of the American task group that had been pursuing it. The batteries were so depleted that the climb to the surface was barely controlled. The hatches opened, and the men who poured out onto the deck were gaunt, dehydrated, covered in rashes, barely able to stand. The air outside hit them like cold water after weeks in a sauna. And then they saw what was around them. 11 American destroyers, helicopters from the USS Randolph hovering overhead with searchlights that turned the night into white noon. Aircraft circling low and fast, their engines shaking the air. The destroyers so close that the men on B-59 could read the hull numbers. Every gun on every ship pointed at them. The entire machinery of American naval power assembled in one place, focused on one target. Savitsky, who came up to the bridge with Arkhipov, was reported afterward to have been stunned into silence by what he saw. He had been operating for 3 days on the assumption that he was somehow evading detection, fighting a kind of guerrilla war under the sea against forces that were trying to find him. The reality he surfaced into was different. They had never been evading detection. They had been located and held from almost the moment they entered the Caribbean. The American forces had not been searching for them. They had been waiting for them. In the early morning light that followed, as B-59 sat stopped in the water communicating with the destroyer USS Coney, the men on the submarine's deck could make out the name painted on the fantail of the carrier in the distance. USS Randolph, a ship that had fought in the Pacific 20 years before, that had recovered John Glenn from the ocean after his historic orbital flight 8 months earlier, and that had spent the last 3 days running the most precise submarine hunt in the history of naval warfare. The Soviets had been inside her trap from the beginning. They had never been invisible for a single hour. The exchange with the USS Coney was tense but not hostile. B-59 was ordered by Soviet Fleet Command, once contact was re-established, to set course back to the Soviet Union. The submarine flew its flag. The crew, by multiple accounts, maintained something between dignity and defiance. Exhausted men who had survived something terrible and were not going to perform humiliation for an audience of American sailors. They turned northeast and began the long passage home. The Americans watched them go. They did not board the submarine. They did not take prisoners. They did not know, would not know for 40 years, that the vessel they had just released back to the Soviet Union had been within one man's objection of firing a nuclear torpedo at their carrier group. The sailors on those destroyers went back to their duties. Some of them, probably, had coffee. The crisis was apparently over. The world, apparently, had been fine all along. The Soviet Navy's reaction to what had happened on B-59 was not gratitude. It was not recognition. It was in the specific way that large institutions respond to events that implicate them in near catastrophes they would prefer not to examine closely. Something closer to official amnesia, with a thin layer of criticism on top. The submarine commanders were called back to Moscow to debrief. The mission had failed in its objective. No Soviet naval base had been established at Mariel. The submarines had all been forced to surface. The operation, from the Soviet military's perspective, had been an embarrassment. The after-action reports focused on the mechanical failures, the radio communication problems, the speed at which the American forces had located and neutralized the submarine group. They did not dwell on what had almost happened on B-59. They certainly did not highlight the fact that the safeguard that prevented a nuclear launch had been an accident of administrative assignment, that the rule requiring 3 authorizations on B-59 had existed not by design, but because Arkhipov happened to be aboard as Flotilla Chief of Staff. Arkhipov returned to his career in the Soviet Navy. He continued commanding submarines. He was promoted over the years to the rank of Vice Admiral, and he retired in the mid-1980s, the same decade Petrov was sitting in his bunker outside Moscow making his own impossible decision. He lived quietly, in the way that Soviet military officers lived quietly when they retired. He did not speak publicly about what had happened on B-59. The story was classified. The Soviet military had no interest in advertising how close its own officers had come to starting a nuclear war on their own initiative. He developed kidney cancer in his later years, possibly a consequence of the radiation exposure from K-19, though this was never officially confirmed. He died on August 19, 1998, at the age of 72. The world did not notice. There were no news articles. There was no ceremony. He was a retired Soviet naval officer who had lived a modest life in a country that had stopped being the Soviet Union 7 years before he died, and there was no reason for anyone outside a small circle of naval historians to know his name. The story of what happened on B-59 did not become public until 2002, when the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis prompted a conference in Havana attended by participants from all 3 sides, American, Soviet, and Cuban. It was there, in the conference rooms of a city 90 miles from where it had all happened, that the former participants began to speak about what they had actually known and what they had not known during those 13 days. The Americans learned, for the first time, that the Soviet submarines had been carrying nuclear torpedoes. They had not known this. They had been dropping signaling charges on submarines armed with Hiroshima-level weapons, and they had had no idea. Robert McNamara, who had been 36 years old and Secretary of Defense when it happened, sat in that conference room 40 years later and said that they had come much closer to nuclear war than anyone had known at the time. He was not a man given to dramatic statements. He had run the Defense Department during Vietnam. He had spent decades looking at the worst of what war could do. And he sat in that room and said, "We had no idea." Thomas Blanton, the director of the National Security Archive, said of Arkhipov at that conference, "A man named Vasili Arkhipov saved the world." It was the kind of statement that sounds like hyperbole, until you understand that it is, by any honest accounting, a literal description of what happened. What do we do with a story like this? There is a version of the Cuban Missile Crisis that most Americans learned in school, the version in which Kennedy and Khrushchev stared at each other across the nuclear abyss, and both blinked, and the world was saved by the wisdom and restraint of two leaders who understood the stakes and chose negotiation over annihilation. That story is true as far as it goes. Kennedy was wise. The back-channel negotiations that resolved the crisis were real and important. The decisions made in the White House and the Kremlin mattered. But the decision made in B-59 was not made in any back channel. It was not made by any leader. It was made by a 34-year-old naval officer in a steel tube at the bottom of the Caribbean Sea, breathing toxic air, surrounded by unconscious men, listening to a captain order a nuclear strike, and saying no because he had been close enough to nuclear reality to understand what that word actually meant. The American Navy performed flawlessly. SOSUS worked. The destroyers found the submarines. The pressure was relentless and precise. Everything the United States had built and trained and deployed worked exactly as designed. And all of that perfection, all of that overwhelming capability, produced a situation in which the only thing standing between the world and nuclear war was one man's refusal to be overwhelmed by it. There is something in this that the American public of 1962, and perhaps of any era, finds genuinely difficult to sit with. We like the story of capability. We like the story of the Navy that built SOSUS in secret and found every submarine in the Atlantic and ran the most precise anti-submarine operation in history. That story is true, and it deserves to be told, because the men and women who built those systems and operated those ships and flew those aircraft over the Sargasso Sea in violent weather in the middle of the night were genuinely extraordinary. They did their jobs with a level of skill and dedication that is worth admiring. But the full story includes the part where all of that capability, all of that precision, all of that overwhelming American power nearly produced a catastrophe that none of those men were aware of. The Navy was so good that it cornered a Soviet captain who had nothing left to lose and a nuclear weapon in his hands. And the only person who stopped what came next was a Soviet officer on the other side, a man who had already looked nuclear catastrophe in the face on K-19 and who recognized it again when it was standing in the same room with him, and who said no. We owe Vasili Arkhipov something that we have no mechanism for paying. He is not an American hero. He was an officer of a Navy that was pointed at us. He was part of a system that we were rightly afraid of, and he spent his career doing what that system asked him to do. But on October 27, 1962, he did something that the system he served did not ask him to do and did not reward him for doing. He looked at a decision that would have been, from a narrow institutional perspective, entirely defensible. The captain ordered it, the political officer approved it, the Americans were attacking, and he decided that it was wrong. He died in 1998, with most of the world having no idea who he was. He deserves better than that. And so do the American sailors on those destroyers who never knew how close they came, and who did their jobs perfectly right up to the edge of something they couldn't see. Thank you for being here for this story. The Cold War is full of moments like this one, moments that happened in the dark, that the people involved were told to forget, that the institutions on both sides preferred not to examine too closely. This channel exists to find those moments and tell them properly, because they are the real history of that era, and the people at the center of them deserve to be remembered. Next week, we are going to leave the water and go into the sky. September 6, 1976. A Soviet Air Force pilot named Viktor Belenko takes off from an airbase in the Soviet Far East on a routine training mission over Japan. He doesn't come back. He lands at a civilian airport, walks up to the tower, and asks for asylum. And in the cockpit of his aircraft, the most secret fighter jet the Soviet Union had ever built, the plane that American defense planners had spent years losing sleep over, the CIA found something that changed everything they thought they knew about Soviet aviation. What they found did not make them more afraid. It made them quietly, profoundly relieved. We will be there next week. Subscribe if this story meant something to you. These histories exist. They happened to real people, and they deserve to be told.